I've included some ideas that I borrowed from cognitive therapy practice, because, as some of you know, one of the lovely projects that I've had the gleeful joy of doing down the years is adapting CBT to make and validate a CBT first aid skills training course for people like us, people who are not mental health practitioners, perhaps a few of you are, but in the main, physical health practitioners. What techniques and ideas can we borrow from CBT that will help us to help our patients? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that towards the second half of what we're saying this evening. There are no difficult concepts, and I can't manage difficult concepts because I'm completely jet lagged, because I got home 2 days ago from 5 weeks in Canada. I don't know which way is it. Now, I'm trying to advance my slides and nothing is happening. So that's the first. Oh, there we go. Hurrah. Do it enough times. Thinking about listening. The thing is, listening is just something that we do, isn't it? It just happens. And those of us who are fortunate to be able to listen easily with our ears completely take that for granted. And those of us who find it more difficult to listen with our ears also realize how much everybody else takes it for granted. And those of us who listen with our eyes absolutely get exasperated by people not looking at us and forming their words properly. So I'm going to try and do both of those things this evening. And I notice that there are people who've enabled closed captioning. So people for whom perhaps listening comes as a little bit more of a challenge. And I'm really glad that you're here. Welcome. So it's an essential component of healthcare practice, and we listen to do a variety of things. Generally, one of the things we're doing is gathering information so that we can make a diagnosis. And then we're at the same time assessing this person's mood, their symptoms, the impact of what's going on for them, for planning the interventions we might suggest and go on to discuss with them. And generally, what we're trying to do is to understand this person's experience who's sitting before us or lying before us as a patient. But it's not just in clinical care, it's part of just being in relationships as human beings. And still, we listen for different reasons. We're still gathering information. We're still assessing what's the emotional temperature of this person that I live with, or this friend that I haven't seen for a while. Or, is this person a lot thinner than the last time I saw them? And what's that telling me? Or is this person a little bit less able to remember things than the last time I saw them? And what's that telling me? So again, we're trying to understand another person's experience. Several times during my being a mum phase, when my kids were younger, my son was referred for investigation because he appeared not to hear. And eventually, a very, very kind ENT surgeon explained to me that there was all the difference in the world between a child not being able to hear and a child not being able to listen. And my child fell into the latter category of not paying enough attention because other things were more interesting. So when we are listening, we need to make sure that we are also hearing not what that person thought, not what we thought they meant, but what that person thought they meant. And I'm going to go on to talk about that in a little moment. So why mindful listening? Well, I think when we're doing this careful listening, we need to maintain an awareness of the whole transaction as it's rolling along. So part of that is focused on the other person. Who is this? And what is it like to be them? And what is it like to be experiencing what's going on for them? How is what's happening in life affecting them? How is this conversation affecting them? How are they putting it all together? How are they synthesizing what's going on? What are they making of their experience? And sometimes we will hear people telling us disastrous things and yet maintaining a very bland approach. Or people who tell us something that seems insignificant and yet their emotional response is very, very strong. So disproportionate emotion tells us that there's something else going on here. And we need to bring curiosity as the principal tool for listening. So other focus, but also mindful awareness of the transaction for ourselves and the transaction itself. What is it that I'm hearing? What am I noticing? What's my response to this? Do I have emotional response to the story that I'm hearing? As this person is telling me their story, are there particular patterns going on of the way they think? Nobody likes me. Bad things always happen to me. I'm bound to be lucky, so this won't be a serious illness either. Those kind of patterns. Or patterns of behaviour of, when things get tough, I stand up and shout, so you better not let me down. Or people whose response is perhaps to step back or to look away or to absent themselves. Can we notice pattern in the things that this person is telling us? Because as we're observing ourselves and the transaction and the person, what we're trying to gauge is, what will our next best and most helpful action be? And that depends on what it is that we're hearing and the way that it's being presented. So this isn't a simple you talk, I listen. It's you talk and I listen and I notice and I observe and I wonder and I am curious and I build a picture over time during the story of what's going on. And so we are paying attention to more than one thing in a mindful way, and yet also being able to dismiss the noise that arises inside ourselves, which of course is part of a mindful meditation practice. So I've taken to not calling these difficult conversations. I think that if we call a conversation difficult, that's a pretty good way of making sure that it will be, in fact, difficult. They are delicate though, aren't they? These are tricky conversations, the conversations that we stand on the edge of feeling a little bit daunted. The conversation with our child's teacher about our disagreement about the way they are disciplining or educating our child. The conversation with the person with whom we share a joint bank account about there isn't quite as much money in the bank as we had thought there should be. The kind of conversation where we've borrowed somebody's car and we're returning it not quite in the same state that we borrowed it. These aren't always clinical conversations. These are life conversations, and we feel daunted by them. And it is true that they feel emotionally daunting and they may require us to be courageous and skilled. But that's not the fault of the conversation. The fact that there will be difficult to hold emotions is the thing that makes it feel daunting. And so if we start to think about, I'm going to be courageous, I'm going to be strong, this is going to be difficult, I'm absolutely ready, we're clipping on our armor. And we're going into the conversation in a way that is defended and defensive. We didn't intend that, but that is the state of mind with which we carry ourselves into the conversation. So I want to invite us to think about being mindfully present by bringing our tenderness rather than our armor. Let us deliberately take off that armor and bring ourselves beside a person in a difficult situation by being able to be their companion. So as I've been thinking about these sorts of conversations, it occurs to me increasingly how having a conversation like this is something that we share. It's not something we do to a patient. It's not something we do to a family member. It's something we do with. It's a partnership. And so actually we're jointly responsible for the conversation flourishing or failing. A really good conversation allows space for each person in it to think about the ideas, to make sense of them, to be curious about them, to string them along to other ideas from previous conversations or earlier in this conversation. So what we're really doing is we're making a space together where thinking can happen, where listening can happen, where reflection can take place. And so really, it's a bit like dancing, isn't it? It's a collaboration. And sometimes you lead and sometimes I lead. And sometimes we're moving forwards and sometimes we're moving backwards. Sometimes we're moving apart, sometimes we're coming further together, and sometimes we make a mistake. We tread on each other's toes. We might even trip somebody up altogether. And when that happens in a dance, we don't start shouting at each other, usually. We actually say, well, I'm really sorry. And we help each other up. We dust each other down. And we try and retrieve the dance. So if we enter into these conversations in a partnership, collaborative way, in the same way, when we say something and as it comes out of your mouth, you think, oh, this is a bomb. Then it's happened to us all. I find myself saying in a conversation, I'm really sorry. That just didn't sound like that in my head. That's just awful and it sounds bad. Do you mind if I rephrase that? That's the stepping on a toe. And the other person almost always, perhaps they'll roll their eyes and purse their lips, but also they'll nod, yeah, have another go. So let's not worry too much about the words. Let's think about the kindness that's between us. Let's think about the tenderness that's between us, because that's the platform on which this dance of conversation can proceed. So let's have a think about what happens as we're listening. These are conversations where we're not listening for information. We're listening to understand. And we get very hung up about what to say. What form of words? What shall I say first? How shall I couch that? Forget about what to say. We've been speaking in sentences that said roughly what we mean since we were about 3 years old. Nobody taught us how to do that. We open our mouth and what's in our mind comes out of it. So forget about what to say. Trust your own brain. Have that mindful appreciation of what your own brain can do for you, to just trust yourself that the right words will come when you've worked out what it is that you want to talk about. Because what's going on here is that we are trying simply to understand how it is from the other person's perspective. That means we can't respond until we've listened and then reflected and think we've understood what the person said and might even have checked back what the person said. And that listening, reflecting, synthesizing, understanding slows a conversation down. It builds silence into the conversation. And when you think about your hero communicators, and you'll all have somebody in your mind. I've got somebody in my mind right now. When I grow up, I want to be like her. What is it that we see that we admire so much? I think we see a few things. I think we see lots of silence, lots of curiosity. We see questions more than we see people making statements, listening rather than telling. We see master communicators accepting that the person is telling them something that is complex and they are able to hold the complexity. And what they don't do is leap to give solutions, to fix, to offer reassurance. And yet that's what's bubbling up inside all of us, because that's our impulse, is to help. So I've been teaching medical students communication skills for what feels like roughly 1,000 years now. And I've always tried to get them to build summaries into their conversations. You know, after you've asked a few questions, it's really good if you just summarize what you've understood so far, so that if you drifted off from understanding a little bit, you can course correct. So you have to offer a summary in a way that says, if I've got this wrong, I really want you to correct me. We then set them off to do their practice, and then I'll say, okay, so you've got 2 minutes left, and I hope that by now there have been lots of summaries, and you can see them all going, because there have been no summaries yet. So eventually I suggested to them that maybe they should give a summary for every 2 questions they ask. A question, summary, waltz. So it turns out I've been talking about dancing in communication skills for an awfully long time. And by suggesting that they might do a summary for every 2 questions, there is a chance that they might do a summary for every 10 questions, at least. But actually, I really advocate this. The first question is the question we can formulate in our own mind. The second question is a response to the person's response. We have no idea what that question is going to be until they've responded and we've listened and reflected and think we've understood. So we're not in control of this conversation. And that's okay, because we share in control of this conversation. And the summaries are the course correct that just checks that we're not going off course. Curiosity is what it's all about. And children are our role models for this, aren't they? So we're asking people to tell us more about something or help us better to understand what it was like for them when this thing happened or that thing happened. And what's really important here is this is part of helping. There are two listeners. There's you sitting in the listener seat, and there's them sitting in the storyteller seat. But as they tell their story, they also are listening. They also are making sense of it. And we've all had this experience, I'm sure you all have, that something's happened and you're chatting to a friend or chatting to somebody in the family, and you're saying, well, so this happened, and then this happened, and then he said, and then I did, and then this, and then, oh, no, hang on. That didn't happen then. That thing happened before this thing. And as they're telling it, they're taking the pieces of this jigsaw that's been rattling around in the box of their brain, and they're starting to join the pieces up in a way that helps them to make sense. So eliciting somebody's story is not time wasting. It's a really, really powerful way of helping them to own the story and become present to the story. And for those of us who are mindfulness practitioners, that's part of the core of our practice, isn't it? Being present, understanding what it is that's at the heart of this challenge, this difficulty, this impasse, or this wonderful, beautiful, glorious good news that we're being told. But when it's bad news, when it's unwelcome news, if we ask them to tell their story, then their distress will arise as they tell it, and that's okay. Our task here is not to fix it, is not to reassure them that it's all going to be fine and we'll find a way to deal with it. And because we are all helpers, all of us in healthcare are helpers or fixers or soothers or all of the above, we will feel our desire to help rising. And I've been working this way now for 30-something years, and I still feel the desire to help arise. We will never stop that. The mindfulness is to notice it and to say, not now. That is not how I'm going to behave. And to choose to sit, to choose to be present to their distress and simply acknowledge it. Because whilst they're working through their distress, they're not really listening to what we're saying. So we are saying things that are supportive, that they don't need to break out of their reflection to listen to. And particularly important during COVID, when a lot of these conversations were by phone, to just be saying things like, oh, this is difficult, isn't it? And I'm really sorry. And you just take your time. And even that healthcare lie of I'm in no hurry, because people need to think that they have the time to think it through. And what's happening is, in what sounds like the longest silence in the world to a new practitioner, a mindful practitioner is aware that lots is happening inside me during this silence, and lots is happening inside you during this silence. Silence is the place where the work actually happens. It's where people consider and put things together and realize things and make their minds up or change their minds. So as they are distressed or silent or pensive, keep out of the way. This is the space that they have needed. And our mindful practice is to hold that space. It might be that we nod, it might be that we touch somebody's shoulder, we might offer them a cuppa, give them tissues if they're weeping, but absolutely just mindfully sit on our inclination to get in the way by giving medical information, by explaining all the treatments we tried before we realized that we couldn't keep your mother on the ventilator any longer. The complicating details that are no longer relevant once you've broken the news that the person is not going to survive. Once you've broken the news that as a couple you're unlikely ever to conceive naturally. Once you've broken the news that this child is not going to develop like other children. The task is to be there and to be a companion as they process their distress. And we need to be mindful also of the time that's left in order to finish safely. I was so bad at this as a new cognitive therapist. And I took it to supervision, and my supervision partners said, well, doesn't the patient keep time with you? Duh. Partnership working, where we say, okay, how much time have we got? So that means we need to be starting to pack up by such and such a time. Some of you heard my conversation with Michael at the very beginning about the signal he's going to give me when there's 5 minutes left, so that we can finish safely and still have time for questions. So joint responsibility for timing can be so helpful, sharing that timekeeping. If you've got the luxury of a 45-minute appointment, you might need a 10-minute warning. If you're in a general practice and you've got a 10-minute appointment, it'll be a 2-minute warning. But it's that point at which we're checking, how are we here and where are we going to take it from here? So we're moving from the depths of the mindful thoughtfulness back up into the present moment and starting to orientate the person into the future. How are you? Thank you for talking to me about that. What needs to happen now? What actions will you take? Who might you need to talk to? How are you going to do that? Where are you going to go to? How are you going to get there? You're helping them to move from that place of being emotionally naked to put their emotional clothes back on, to get back into the cold world, including checking whether we're going to meet again and what the arrangements for that might be. And finishing safely is important, not just for the person we're trying to help, it's important for us as well. So we've got 10 minutes left, and I want to talk briefly about using some cognitive therapy ideas in our communications. So I would like us to do an experiment, and what's going to be difficult is you can't really talk to us, and I hadn't anticipated that. So I'm going to have to talk you through this experiment, and you're just going to have to imagine yourselves. So if we were in a lecture theatre together, I would be inviting some volunteers to come to the front. And I want you to think about what happens to you when people ask for volunteers. Are you the compulsive volunteer who can't bear the silence? Or are you the person who looks at the ground and hopes that they're not going to ask me? What's going through your mind about volunteering? And now I want you to imagine that I called your name and you came to the front to help me. And I'm giving you a balloon. So we've got a row of us and we've all got a balloon, including me, and we're going to blow our balloon up as hard as we can. And we're going to tie a knot in the end of it. So just blow your balloon up. And I know some of you are useless at blowing balloons up, but so am I. Let's imagine that these are superb balloons where we managed to do it in just a few breaths. They're big, tight, shiny balloons. And we haven't popped them whilst tying the knot. Okay. So you're at the front of the room and other people are watching you as you're doing this. What's it like to be at the front of the room while people are watching? What's going through your mind about what's going on? How does your body feel because you've been puffing hard to blow up the balloon? Now I'm going to ask you to do something a little bit strange. I'm going to ask you to take the knotted end of your balloon and put it in your mouth. I want you to imagine having that rubbery end of the balloon in your mouth and the rest of the balloon slightly in front of your nose and your eyes because you've blown it up so well. It's fabulous. I want you to imagine how it feels to be standing there with a balloon sticking out of your mouth in front of a classroom full of people that you might not really know. And now I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. But before I do that, I am going to take the great big brooch that I have on my sweater out of my sweater and show you its big, shiny pin. You've got a balloon in your mouth. I've got a balloon in my hand. And I have a pin. So you're standing in a line and I'm walking up and down. And you can hear where I am by where my voice is. You've got a balloon in your mouth. And I've got a pin. And I want you to notice what you're thinking about that. And I want you to notice how your body feels at the idea of what might be going to happen to our balloon and a pin. And a lady who'd seemed so nice before she did this to you. What's your body doing? What emotions are you noticing? And what are you doing? Are you cheating? Are you peeking? Are you opening your eyes? Do you feel better when my voice is further away? What's the worst thing that could happen? Are you ready? Are you waiting? There's a massive bang. You can open your eyes. Everybody in the line has still got a balloon in their mouth. But my balloon has been burnt. You can sit back in your places now. Thank you very much. So, the reason we're doing that is to think about the experience of being put under stress and what goes through people's minds as that happens. And lots of things happen all at the same time, but we're going to start to separate them out. The sorts of thoughts that people have told me, because I've been torturing people like this for years down at a variety of communication skills training sessions. Things like, oh, I don't want to volunteer because I might look silly. Or, I am now up on the stage with a balloon in my mouth. I definitely look silly. I have people telling me that they felt uncalm and they thought I need to stay calm. And questions like, what if it's my balloon? What if she picks me? What if it bangs? And then checking for how far away my voice was. Am I safe? What do I need to do to protect myself? And some people's thoughts were a kind of sensory thought of what it would be like if it was my balloon, feeling the balloon splattering, hearing the balloon bursting. And in fact, every time I do this, when I bang the balloon, everybody in the line, even though they're trying very hard to stay calm, jumps. So it's enormous fun. What a horrible person I am. As those thoughts are going through their minds, people are also noticing some emotions. And some of them are feeling anxious, fearful. They don't want this thing to happen to them. I've had some people be very angry. How dare I do that to them? And that's a very interesting response from people who think that this should not be happening. And then other people who either think, oh, well, she probably won't burst my balloon. This is bound to be some kind of an exercise, or just utterly embarrassed to be doing something so ridiculous. And some people are a bit excited to see what's going to happen. What the room observes best is the behaviours. Lots of giggling and laughter as the balloons are being blown up. And then people no longer quite so relaxed once the balloon is in their mouth and they know about the pin. So people describe focusing on their breathing in order to relax themselves, or focus on defending themselves. So they're clenching their teeth and they're clenching their eyes. So if it's their balloon, they won't get bits of balloon in their eyes. And people really attending to where I am and taking up defensive body positions, hunching their shoulders, clenching their fists, and there's always somebody who peeks. So defensive behaviors, and then these bodily sensations that we associate with stress, fast heart and palpitations, the unpleasant taste and smell of a rubbery balloon, people feeling a bit trembly because their muscles are very tight, wobbly legs or wobbly hands, and then butterflies in their tummy, or feeling restless and fidgety, and they can't wait for me to get it over with. This is a simple cognitive therapy formulation, but what it's doing is it's saying that this total experience, which isn't experienced as 4 separate domains, but as all of this going on at once, is separatable out. And when we're listening to people telling us their difficult stories, one of the things that we can mindfully observe is, what are they giving me lots of? And what are they actually not giving me very much of at all? So some people will be able to tell you all about everybody else's behaviors and how unfair it is. and very little about their own behaviours. So these are their thoughts that they're telling you, and perhaps their emotions of being angry and fed up with people, but not telling you about the things that they might be doing that are triggering other people to be a bit fed up with them. Some people give us all of their bodily sensations, but don't tell us at all what their emotions are about having a lot of pain or being very breathless. So by mindfully noticing, we can be curious about the domains that we're not getting a lot of information about. So thoughts and emotions, behaviors and bodily sensations all interact with each other. And it's very difficult to change bodily sensations or emotions easily, but we can learn to recognize them and respond in an intentional way to them. We can also learn to recognize thinking that isn't terribly helpful or modify behaviors that aren't very helpful. So not all of our thoughts are true, although we believe them. Not all true thoughts are helpful. So I've worked with a lot of parents of young children. The parent is dying. They can't bear the idea of this child going into the future without them. They're worried that the child will be bereaved for the rest of their life. And they now can't enjoy parent contact time because every time they have contact with their children, they're thinking those true but dreadful thoughts. And yet sometimes that's a helpful thought. If you use that thought to make life story books, to make memory books, to build memory boxes, that true thought becomes a helpful way of helping in their bereaved future. So there's a time where that thought is helpful and a time where you can suspend that thought in order to do memory building with the children in a joyous way. So noticing those thoughts, teaching people to be mindful of what's going through their mind so they can notice it and challenge it or distract themselves from it, but be kind to themselves. So here's a mum who's had a row with a child.
Yeah, thank you.
And he's gone out on his motorbike. And here she is thinking about all the things she's done wrong. And here are the emotions that she's experiencing. And here's her bodily sensations and her behavior, which of course is completely unhelpful, of watching the clock and checking her phone all of the time, making herself more and more worried. So we do stuff to try and help ourselves, and often it undermines us. So here's a guy with metastatic prostate cancer who's been recommended to take morphine for his bone metastases, and his belief is that morphine is dangerous, so he shouldn't take it. I should save it for when I'm sicker, and because I can't do anything, I'm spoiling my family's lives. So he's lonely and sad and frightened and guilty about spoiling their lives because he's got pain all the time. He's sleeping badly, so he's tired all the time, so he's tearful, and he's avoiding taking the morphine, and he's not going out in case of pain. He's not asking help. So all of his actions are avoiding actions, and he hasn't noticed that. So you know how to help this patient, but you might only get, I'm sleeping badly and I'm tearful all the time. Or you might only get, I'm lonely and sad and I'm a burden to my family. So it's by noticing and being curious about the other components. So I want to suggest to you, before we break for questions, a practice idea that you might try out sometime over the weekend on your unsuspecting family. So you ask somebody to share a current dilemma with you. It has to be a real dilemma, but not something that's really deep and painful and personal, because it's not really about their dilemma. It's about you learning this listening exercise. But it has to not be something that they've already resolved. And just do the question summary once. So you listen and you respond only with questions and summaries. And 7 to 10 minutes. Might be something like somebody's trying to decide on a holiday or picking a birthday present for somebody or where to go for a meal. Nothing big. And while you're doing it, observe yourself. Be mindful of your impulse to offer advice or give reassurance. Clock it and try to resist it. And sometimes you will, and sometimes you won't. And you'll find yourself giving advice or disguising it as a question. So that's okay. No, that's not okay. And notice what they tell you and notice what they leave out and ask questions around that as well. And then afterwards, notice for yourself how it felt not to give any advice or anti-advice, as it says on here, any advice or reassurance. how it felt to be so formulaic in that question, summary formula, and what was going on for you. What were you mindful of your own thoughts as you were doing the exercise? And then ask the other person to give you some feedback about how did it feel to be listened to in this very particular way? Because almost always the person being listened to doesn't notice the formula. And what was the impact on their dilemma? Actually, if we offer advice, we normally try to offer the advice we would take, and it's often not a good fit for somebody else. So by sitting and just asking them more questions, very often they'll solve their dilemma, or they'll move to a new view of their dilemma. And all you did was ask questions. So you don't have to solve it. So this is my summary, that mindful listening, what we're talking about is being aware of our intention to listen, being aware of the noise in our heads without becoming distracted by it, and being aware of the components, both of our own experience and the other person's experience. What are our thoughts? What's our self-talk? How are we labeling ourselves? What emotions? It's hard to work out sometimes what's an emotion and what's a thought. Emotions can usually be labeled with a single word: fear, anxiety, frustration, anger, sadness. Behaviour is what we're doing, but also what we or the other person might be avoiding doing, and what's happening in our bodies. So that's a gallop through mindful listening. I wish you happy listening, and I'll come out of my screen share so that, I was going to say so we can see each other, but actually it's just so that Michael and I can see each other, but so that if you've got comments or questions, we can deal with them.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. I could have listened to you for a few more hours easily. So it's really interesting. And so I'm just going to invite anybody to raise a hand to ask a question verbally. So has anybody got a question?
Hi, Michael. We've got a question from James in the chat.
I see. Brilliant. Thank you. So James says, thank you for your great talk. I wondered if you had any suggestions for how educators might encourage students to adopt a position of curiosity within the consultation. For many students, perhaps with assessment and logbooks in mind, patient contact seems to have become increasingly transactional and less human.
Great question. And I agree. So I have recently taken to playing the question summary waltz with medical students. And I did it last year with the Newcastle University Palliative Care Society. Don't know whether Sunderland has one yet, but the Association for Palliative Medicine now has a student arm. So if you wanted a palliative care society, what I like about Newcastle University is that it's multi-professional. And so again, a lovely fit for things that you're doing in Sunderland as well. So I think one of the things that students discover when you play the question summary waltz over a current dilemma game is how incredibly powerful it is to have somebody just listen to you and be curious about you and help you to move yourself through your own dilemma. And I think that also we perhaps need to help students to think about when they're talking to patients in a very kind of transactional way, because the task is clerk this patient, then if we're setting the task in a way that requires transaction. Whereas if the task is get to know this patient, so those longer visits, those projects where they, meet a pregnant mum or follow the baby for the first year, or go and meet a person with a long-term condition, and really understand the impact on their life of, being a retired miner with a terrible chest condition and living on oxygen at home, and disturbing the family with your coughing at night and not being able to go on holiday or get to play with the grandchildren in the way that you want to, those sorts of things. I think they are the things that help us to see patients as human beings in the round with a whole life. But if we keep setting transactional tasks, they'll keep producing transactional answers. Maybe we need to be more curious about what it is that will help them to do that. So not an answer, James, just a curious playing with the ideas.
Thank you very much, James. So we have a couple more comments, a question here from Susan Jameson. Thank you, Susan. To follow up on the point and practice idea too, about how we might feel about being listened to via QQS format. How do patients feel? And then she comments further down in brackets, thinking if they come expecting you to fix them.
Well, I think so. This is a really important point, isn't it? That if you're a clinician and the consultation is, I've got a pain in my leg, doc, can you help me with the pain in my leg? Then obviously, if we can help with the pain in their leg, that is the task. But I've got a pain in my leg, doc, and I've got extensive metastatic prostate cancer is very different from I've got a pain in my leg, doc, because I've got a torn medial meniscus. That springs to mind because I've recently been fixed by an orthopedic surgeon for that. Now, what was interesting in that was that to start off with, my orthopedic surgeon advised that I should give up running and take up swimming as well. I hate swimming. I absolutely hate swimming. There was no notion of, I wonder what we can do to help you stay active. There was only fixing. I was not listened to. So sometimes, even when the situation seems relatively transactional, I have a torn meniscus, you're an orthopedic surgeon, what are you going to do about it? We still need to get into that curiosity about this woman who's in her 7th decade, I know, hard to believe, wants to remain fit. What are the ways that she sees possible for her to remain fit, rather than telling me to get on a bike when I don't live in a safe place, or go swimming when I can't afford maybe to go to a swimming pool? So it's about helping people to think about the situation that their patient is in and perceive it, isn't it? And sometimes it's a transaction. I've got a sore throat. Let me look at your throat. I think that's viral. Sorry, can't give you antibiotics, but it's still sore. In a few days, let me know. Take painkillers, keep your fluids up. Or, oh, that's horrible and need to swab it. You know, that's a relatively transactional thing. But even then, who's at home? Who's looking after you? What's going to happen if you're hot and shivery and can't get out of bed? What about your immunocompromised partner that I won't know about if I don't ask you? So we need to be curious about our patients. It needn't extend the consultation terribly long, but it can help us. But where the problem isn't an easy fix, that's where this really becomes a very important thing, because it might be that we have no fix to offer. And feeling understood then becomes really, really important for this person.
Thank you very much indeed. Susan, thanks for your reply, Kathryn, there. And we've got a comment from Chandra Anand. Just a comment, really, this is much more than attentive listening. This is a real tuning in to another human being. Don't know if you want to respond to that as a statement.
Yeah, I suppose it is. I suppose it is. And that's part of our role, I think. That, you know, when we have what we used to call non-compliance, and we've gradually changed the language around it, almost always what didn't happen in the first place is we didn't establish that partnership of equals, working out what's going to be an acceptable intervention or an acceptable set of behaviors to recommend to this person, like telling me to go swimming. So it's not that it doesn't matter, it matters very much, but it doesn't have to take a great deal of time.
Yeah, great. We have time for maybe about 5 more minutes or so for more questions, but just while people are reflecting, I've got a bit of a question for you as well, Kathryn. I really was struck about what you said about calling a conversation difficult before you enter into the conversation, about how we prejudge a situation, how we frame a situation before we go into it. From a mindfulness perspective, we often talk about this in terms of approaching a situation with a beginner's mind, taking a non-judgmental, kindly approach, and not seeing things as problems to react to, but situations to respond to. And that change of language actually has quite a significant effect on how we actually enter a situation or this conversation. I just wondered whether you could expand on that a little bit and from your experience.
Yeah, so something that springs to mind is I started using the word tender about these conversations almost as a kind of counter-offensive to the language of difficult conversations. And then one day I was on a ward where I worked regularly with the palliative care support team, and a surgeon was about to go into a single room to tell a patient that he'd known for a long time that his colon cancer was metastatic, and that there wasn't a surgical option now for treatment. And I was walking past, he had his hand on the doorknob, and he looked at me and he kind of rolled his eyes because I knew this patient. He said, "I hate doing this. These are such difficult conversations." And I stopped and I thought, there's a thing I want to say here. I'm not sure whether he'll hit me if I say it. My colleague wasn't violent. I didn't really think he would hit me, but I wondered whether, in fact, it would be an unhelpful comment for him. I thought I'd try it. What would happen, do you think, I said to him, if you thought of it more as a tender conversation? Because the people behind that door will be so glad it's you. They've known you for a long time and they absolutely trust you. And there really isn't another one of us who's got the relationship with them that you've got, and that's why it feels difficult for you. But I just wonder whether tender might be a more helpful word for you to have in your head.
Yeah.
And he looked at me and he rolled his eyes. And I smiled because, yeah, I thought this is a kind of boy-girl thing. This is a surgeon-physician thing. This is I do practical things versus a touchy-feely thing. And we've known each other for many, many years. Anyway, he came and found me the next day. And I thought, oh, I'm in trouble. But no, he came to say, do you know what? That was so helpful. The whole conversation went so differently. And actually, I'm a bit embarrassed to say that I think I cried during the conversation, and that's never happened to me before. And I thought, oh, that's so interesting. That is so interesting. And that was an incident probably about 10 years ago, but it sowed the seeds for me of actually this rebadging, this relabeling and reframing actually does make us step through the door differently.
Yeah. And do you think that medical students find that quite difficult given everything else they have to think about in these situations? Because we know medical students, depending on their stage, often are working with the rules, the algorithms, the protocols. They're thinking about their clinical reasoning skills. They're thinking about the situation. It can be a cognitive overload in some situations. Do you think a lot of that gets in the way and almost kind of trains into them that they have to kind of judge a situation before they go into it, and interrupts their ability to kind of really tune in?
That's interesting, isn't it? That's a really interesting question. Because I wonder whether if we allowed them to be properly curious with an information structure that helps them to work out what to do once they fully understood the situation, would we not find that they followed the right way through the algorithm without thinking about the algorithm? Doesn't the algorithm actually describe what successful communication looks like? And if we set them up to succeed, then they will find their way through the communication part of the algorithm sensibly and wisely. And also, it's really important, I think, that they don't think that there are right things to say and wrong things to say. There are right ways to be and wrong ways to be. But if you're disposed to be kind, concerned, and curious, then you will elicit the correct information. The difficulty is that invites us as clinicians and them as clinicians in training to take our guard down. And we need to think about the pastoral care that we will provide for each other and for our students if we're frequently asking them to be present to other people's pain.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. And I'll just invite anybody else, if they've got any other questions, please, we have a few more minutes. But what came to mind today, I was having a conversation via email with somebody who's going to run a journal club for me at the university, and talking about being your authentic self with patients, and whether that is possible, given that you also have other things on yourself. You have family pressures and other things going on in your life, other patients to say that. How much can you be your authentic self, and how does that affect your communication? I don't know if that resonates with the kind of things that you're saying there.
I think that if we bring ourselves to be present, then the most authentic self I can be today is the person who turns up. So I've turned up jet lagged. I'm the most authentic self I can be today. I might have been a bit more sparky, and my time management might have been a bit better if we were doing this in 2 weeks' time instead. I don't need to tell you all the things that are going on in my life. I don't owe you that. And we need to recognize also that patients also have boundaries, and they decide who will come across those boundaries. And we know, don't we, in a hospital setting, that some people get more information than others. And sometimes that's a personality thing. You know, there are some colleagues that we have, medical colleagues, nursing colleagues, who seem to know absolutely everything. And I talk to that person and they didn't tell me that. And that's something about the way they bring themselves to those conversations. But it's also who people choose. When I did my house jobs, I did my surgical job in North Shields in the hospital that's now a housing estate, Preston Hospital. And we had a piece of pink paper on the back of the case notes, which was for the housekeeper to write on, because she wasn't allowed to look in the case notes because she wasn't a member of the clinical team. But everybody told Maisie what their worries were. And the consultant recognized that strength of her personality. And there was a special Maisie sheet on the back of the notes so that Maisie could write, you know, this lady's worrying about her scar falling apart, or this lady's child is starting school in 3 days and she's worried she won't be home in time. And patients will very often ask test questions for people who they think won't know the answers yet. So they'll ask the medical students, am I dying? They'll ask the housekeeper, am I dying? Because I need to hear those words coming out of my mouth, but I need to hear them in a way where you couldn't probably say yes. So, yeah, we need to bring our authentic self and present it, and then the patient chooses whether we're the right person or not.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm aware that some people on this call may not be healthcare professionals. I'm just wondering whether there's, just before we go into a little meditation, whether you could give one word of wisdom that people generally could take into their lives about mindful listening.
I think that all of our best conversations happen when we're prepared to stay with a person in their distress. And whether that's at the school gate or in the post office or with your bestie or with a colleague or with a patient, it's the same demeanor, to be present, but to share it. So, you know, if you're in the post office and you're on your way to do the school pickup, to be able to say to the distressed person, listen, I'm really happy to listen to this, but I've got to go and do the school pickup first. Can we pick it up later? So let's treat each other as human beings first.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kathryn. I'm just going to lead now a short meditation to bring us to a close, and then we can say our goodbyes after that and say thank you to everybody. So if you're willing, if anybody's willing, please, I invite you to take a short meditation for a few minutes. So just finding a comfortable position in your chair, maybe closing your eyes if you wish. Just finding a steady position, allowing the shoulders to relax and bringing the shoulders slightly back to open the chest. I invite you to take some slow, deep, soft breaths, breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth. Perhaps extending the out breath a little more than you normally would. And when you're ready, relaxing the breath to its natural pace and rhythm. And just tuning in to your body, just noticing how your body feels right now. Noticing your posture, your facial expression. There may be areas of ease, areas of tightness. Just simply noticing, and if it's possible, softening any of those tight areas. And also noticing how you feel after this conversation. Perhaps dropping the attention around the heart area and just tuning in to your felt experience of what's been said. Do you feel motivated, excited, slightly unsettled, contented? And what's going through your mind right now? What thoughts are arising? Are there any impulsive thoughts? Are there gaps between your thoughts? Are there silences? Where's the mind going to? Just allowing those thoughts, feelings, those bodily sensations to rise and fall away. Now bringing your attention to your breathing. Just simply noticing when you're breathing in and when you're breathing out. Mind wanders, simply noticing, and then gently guiding your attention back to your breathing. Expanding your field of attention to the whole body, perhaps imagining the whole body is breathing, expanding and contracting with each breath. Now sensing into your surroundings, your environment, noticing particular sounds. Perhaps like me, you can hear the sound of the rain. Perhaps you can hear traffic in the distance. And then for the final few moments, just sitting in an open awareness of your whole experience, just letting thoughts, feelings, bodily sensations, sounds, etc. just flow through you, rising and falling away. Noticing now the connection with the chair, with the floor. Feeling a sense of groundedness. And when you're ready, just gently opening the eyes and easing yourself out of the practice. Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for everybody for booking and coming along to listen to Kathryn. And thank you very much indeed, Kathryn, for taking the time out to do this, especially when you're jet lagged. Really appreciate it. So yeah, so go well, everybody. Thank you very much indeed. Take good care of yourselves, and I hope this has some impact in your lives, in your profession. And yeah, I'd highly recommend Kathryn's books with the end in mind, and listen if you want to follow this up further. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me. Good night, everybody.
Good night.